I'm Nick Savaidis, the founder of Etiko Fair Trade. We're a small business that specialises in marketing, actually developing and marketing ethically produced, eco-friendly footwear, clothing and sports goods. The Etiko company owns Etiko Fair Trade, which is our fashion brand, where we market a sneaker and made from organic cotton, natural rubber in a fair trade accredited factory. We market a range of rubber thongs which are made from natural rubber and raise money for different charities in Australia. We also have a sports brand called Jinta Sport, which is Australia's only fair trade sports brand. And we also distribute other products like Pants to Poverty, which is an organic fair trade underwear brand. So one company, Etiko, marketing 3 different brands in Australia. We sell products Australia-wide through our website, which is the Fairtrade Shop, or fairtradeshop.com.au. We also sell it through eco-ethical retailer like Friends of the Earth and the Green Collective and a number of other eco-ethical retailers around Australia. And we do lots of festivals where we kind of raise the profile of fair trade and promote our Etiko, Jinta and Pants to Poverty brands. So yeah, small business doing lots of stuff in the ethical space, in the social procurement space. Our social impact isn't really in Australia, it's actually in the countries where we source our products. So most people have heard about the use of child labour and the use of sweatshop labour, and it's amazing that in 2012 things like that still happen. I mean, you probably heard that about a month ago, 120 workers were burnt to death in Bangladesh in a factory that was making garments for some of the biggest fashion retailers in the world. We're not sure that any of that stuff was actually sold in Australia, but given that they were doing it for lots of companies around the world, we wouldn't be surprised. I mean, 3 months ago, the biggest sports brand in Australia, sorry, one of the biggest sports brands in Australia, an iconic sports brand, which is the best known football brand, the Aussie Rule football brand, was actually caught using child labour in India. So, you know, people think that child labour, sweatshop labour, slave labour is a thing of the past, but the reality is that there's more slave labour now than there ever has been in the history of mankind. According to World Vision, there's about 300 million children working around the world today, and about 10% of those kids are working in servitude, which is a nice way of saying slavery. And a lot of those kids are making clothing that we wear, the home decorations, or the decorations we put up during Christmas, the toys that our kids play with. I personally find it staggering that in this day and age, things like that still happen, and that we in the developed world, we as consumers, benefit from the exploitation of workers in developing countries. So I created Etiko because I felt that there was a need to offer consumers an alternative. And you know, we've been doing it for 6 years. We were the first non-food company in Australia to be certified fair trade. And we've been at it since 2004, and we've gone and seen the fair trade movement grow over the years from being a very small movement in 2004 to being something quite significant in this day and age, and continues to grow. You know, the light bulb has flashed quite a few times over my life. I speak about it with my family, and you know, they joke about how I ended up where I am now. And you know, as a kid, you know, I was brought up in a family that really struggled financially. When I was an infant, my parents lost their home because they couldn't afford to make the repayments, and I think we moved from house to house for quite a few years after that. And then later on, when I was in primary school, my parents kind of re-established themselves and bought themselves a house in Thornbury, you know, in a northern suburb of Melbourne, which by the way, now is a really expensive place to live. At the time, no one wanted to live there. But yeah, we moved there as when my parents got themselves up and going again the second time. And you know, we, like a lot of migrant families in those days, the house was owned by my parents, but we had 2 other families living with us, which made it interesting because there was only 3 bedrooms, so it was a very squeezy kind of lifestyle. So you know, we were living in a very dire circumstances. I remember as a kid, I remember my parents always worried about money, where it was going to come from, how are they going to pay their bills. And I remember my mum, she had a sewing machine next to our television, and this is not unusual in those days. Most migrant families had the same situation. Sewing machine next to the television, and next to the sewing machine there was a pile of fabric. And every Monday a car would come around, a van would come around, leave the fabric in our lounge room, and then my mum would spend the rest of the week sewing garments and shirts, skirts, and at the end of the week they'd collect, the guy who dropped them off would collect them, the finished garments, and she was being paid, I can vaguely remember, somewhere between 10 and 20 cents per garment. But I remember when I was about 8 years old, I actually came into the city with an older cousin of mine who, she was into fashion, and she took me to a shop called the House of Maryvale in Mr. John, which in the late 60s, early 70s was the place to go buy your clothing if you were into fashion and you had the money to spend as well. And I remember some shirt that my mother had made had been paid 15 cents or so, being sold for $35 at the time. And as an 8-year-old, I thought that just didn't seem right, that my mum was being paid 15 cents for a garment that was being sold for $35. And I thought, something's not right here. But what do you do about it as a kid? Then life goes on. My parents sold their house in Thornbury, and we moved to a fruit block in the Riverland. And my parents did quite well initially, but then Australia's biggest export market for fruit, the UK, joined the EU. So the price of fruit in Australia collapsed. So when we were living in Melbourne, I saw how factory workers and kind of garment workers kind of struggled. So when we moved to South Australia, I saw how farmers kind of struggled there. So there's another light bulb moment. But what do you do about it as a kid? Then you started coming across some teachers who were very kind of enlightened, or I suppose a bit left-leaning, and they kind of made us aware of the apartheid was a big issue. The Vietnam War was an issue, and as a young kid, I couldn't work out why everyone wasn't against apartheid. I couldn't work out why everyone wasn't against the Vietnam War. I couldn't work out why everyone wasn't for women's liberation, and I couldn't work out why everyone wasn't barracking for St Kilda. So I've always had a thing for the underdog. When I went into university. It was actually RMIT, it was where I started my tertiary education. I started reading New Internationalist magazine, which is still around, and kind of really opened my eyes, because I kind of realised that the exploitation of workers and farmers wasn't restricted to Australia, it was actually an international kind of thing. So I used to go into kind of shoe shops and ask them if they could guarantee me that the shoes they were selling to me weren't made in sweatshops or with child labour, and they looked at me as if I was crazy. Same with sports gear. I just did it just to see what the response would be. No one knew, no one cared. I used to go into fruit shops and supermarkets and ask them why they were selling foreign fruit in Australia when Australian farmers were having to leave the fruit on the trees because they couldn't find any markets. And I suppose that's when I started becoming a more conscious consumer. But what do you do about it? There wasn't an alternative. So years later, after I was became qualified as a teacher, I used to talk to kids about the impact of globalisation, and we did look at issues such as child labour and sweatshop labour, and they'd all get upset, especially when you're showing videos or photos. But then they turn up to school wearing the very brands that were doing it. I used to coach school soccer teams, and I used to ask myself, what were the chances of the kids I was coaching soccer playing with balls made by child labour? And 20 years ago, it was guaranteed. And amazingly, in 2012, it's still guaranteed. There's still a very high chance of that actually happening. So there's a series of light bulbs. But what got me into starting my own social enterprise was in the early 90s, I was actually appointed as an adult educator to work with remote Aboriginal communities. And I was sent to the Northern Territory to run literacy and numeracy programs. But when I got to the communities, we had community meetings to talk about what they wanted me to do, and people said, what's the point of doing literacy and numeracy? There's no jobs. So I had a word with my immediate supervisor, who was also based on the communities, and we came up with a strategy that I would start developing businesses which created jobs on the community, and we could actually run literacy and numeracy programs based around the jobs. So my immediate boss would write reports to the education department saying that I was doing all this face-to-face classroom teaching, but in actual fact we was developing a whole series of small micro businesses which were owned by the communities. So we set up with a community laundromat which employed 2 women, actually no, 4 women, it was actually 4 women because they did rotations. And that cost $10,000 and it provided washing machines for the whole community, and it created jobs for these ladies. And we did basic numeracy skills around running doing some basic bookkeeping, using telephone communications and making notes about maintenance and things like that. We set up a screen printing business which was called Your Rumpy Crafts, and we'd bring in people from around Australia to run screen printing business workshops in the community, and we were selling t-shirts Australia-wide through Community Aid Abroad, which became Oxfam, and through shops in Alice Springs. We started a slaughterhouse because the community had its own cattle, which they'd send off to Adelaide to be slaughtered, then they'd buy it back. So we thought, why not have the slaughterhouse on the community? So these are all kind of enterprises. We thought what we're doing is running businesses that the communities needed. Now, in this day and age, it's called a social enterprise. We didn't hear about the word. I'd never heard the expression social enterprise until more recently. But yeah, I did that for 5 years, and for family reasons, we had to come back to Melbourne. And the idea of going back to what I was doing before I moved to the Northern Territory was working as a high school teacher. Just didn't have the same kind of appeal. I did it for a short while, reluctantly, until I could actually get my own social enterprise off the ground. The problem is that I couldn't apply for some government grant or get a donation from anyone. I had to actually risk my family's home and create a for-profit kind of business, because you can't do what we do without making profit. So basically, our social impact now is in the countries we source our products from, but we also give back to communities in Australia. So with our Jinta sports brand, which is the only fair trade sports brand in Australia, we actually give 2.5% of all our sales to funding sports programs on remote Indigenous communities. Jinta, the brand, is actually an Aboriginal name, it means winner. So we thought it was only fair that we'd actually give back to the kind of communities. And I kept in touch with the people that I used to work with in the Northern Territory. So every quarter we give them a report and we give them some cash or sports gear, whatever they want. And that's how we kind of have a positive impact in Australia as well as in the countries that we source our products from. So with the Etiko brand, we're hoping to create a couple of brands, the Etiko fashion brand and sports brand and the Jinta sports brand, 2 brands which kind of go out and compete in the mainstream against some of the biggest retailers, biggest brands. I mean, we want it, with the Etiko brand, we're trying to create a street fashion brand which is just as cool and is just as good quality and at a reasonable price as the major sports brand, but one which is the most eco-ethical alternative to those brands possible. The same with the Jinta sports brand. We want to create a cool sports brand which markets good quality products, but which are sourced as ethically as possible. So I've been doing this for 6 years, and it's just amazing to see how it's grown during that time. It'll be interesting to see where we are in 6 years' time. And what I'm hoping is that we're not just seen as a niche activist brand, but one that's actually out there in the mainstream marketplace, competing with the big brands at a level that would have a major significant impact on the people on the lives of the people that we're working with. Because in order to maximise the social benefit, we need to scale the business up quite significantly. So we need consumers to start applying their values to their purchasing decisions. We need schools who talk about social justice and sustainability to actually start applying that to their procurement policies. It doesn't matter whether it's a high school or a university. We need government departments who talk about ethical purchasing policies to do more than just ask their suppliers to tick a box. But basically, we're out there trying to help people and organisations live their values. And that's what fair trade's all about. It's actually helping people live their values. It doesn't matter whether it's fair trade coffee or fair trade chocolate or fair trade sports gear and fashion.